As a rule, the main mystery in a murder case is identifying who committed it. In this instance, however, we know from the very beginning who pulled the trigger. The question is, was it a terrible mistake or a cold-blooded murder? Linda and Patrick Duffy had been happily married until April 26, 2007, when Linda made a panicked call to Los Angeles Emergency Services. When police officers arrived, they found Patrick Duffy on the couch. His left hand rested in his pocket, and his right knee was propped on a cushion. The man's position appeared comfortable, relaxed, as if he were simply asleep. But he wasn't. He was dead. His head, along with the couch, the walls, and the living room floor, was spattered with drying blood. It didn't take an expert to realize the man had been shot in the head. At first glance, Detective Shannon Lauren thought Patrick had lain down to rest on the couch when someone entered and shot him. Her partner, Sean McCarthy, leaned toward the idea of an accident. After 13 years of investigating crimes, he knew how to notice the smallest details, and here he saw nothing suspicious. The couple's 2 teenage sons, Sean and Thomas, were at school, leaving Linda as the sole witness to what had happened. She agreed to go to the station with the detectives and, without a lawyer, willingly answered their questions all night long. Linda Duffy was always unique. She had an unshakable, cheerful disposition, positive, lively, and full of humor. Wake her up in the middle of the night and she'd happily share a funny story. Some even called her a chameleon for her habit of mimicking different accents. Despite her quirks and eccentricities, those who knew Linda adored her. She was a wonderful person and a great friend. In the 1980s, she met her perfect match, Patrick Duffy. Patrick was an electronics engineer, a private pilot, and a firearms enthusiast. Linda often said her dreams had come true and that she couldn't have been happier. After dating for 4 years, they decided to get married. Friends and family alike believed the couple had truly found soulmates in one another, sharing a love for jokes, pranks, and playful antics. It was precisely this playful streak that became the cornerstone of Linda's account of what happened that day. She explained that she and Patrick had returned from the hospital where he had been treated for chronic circulation issues. Patrick was planning to visit the shooting range afterward. Normally, one of his 3 revolvers was kept in a small locked case, but that day, it was lying next to him. Linda usually didn't touch firearms, but that day she picked it up to have a closer look. And that's where her story began to take a bizarre turn. She said she asked Patrick where the bullets were, and he replied, "Over there." Then, mimicking the voice of the famous cartoon character Elmer Fudd, he added,
"No more bullets."
Laughing, Linda repeated,
"No more bullets?"
assuming the chamber was empty. She thought it would be safe to try a trick Patrick had once taught her. Through tears, she told detectives that she only wanted to impress her husband by showing off her cowboy-style shooting skills. Any fan of Westerns knows what that means. The hero fans the hammer of the revolver, quickly pulling the trigger repeatedly to take down a row of enemies. Linda Duffy claimed that once she started firing in this way, she couldn't stop and accidentally shot Patrick in the head. He had leaned forward at just the wrong moment, ending up directly in the line of fire. Her story was so incredible that it was hard to believe, yet at the same time, it seemed impossible to imagine her inventing it. The detectives listened to her account with a mixture of astonishment and skepticism. Detective Lauren didn't believe Linda, while his partner found the tale just crazy enough to be true. After the interview, they let Linda go home. There wasn't enough evidence to justify an arrest, but they wanted a clearer picture of how everything had unfolded. Their understanding deepened significantly once they received the medical examiner's report. The medical examiner found not 1 but 2 bullets in Patrick's head. The entry wounds were so close together that even seasoned officers hadn't noticed them initially. Linda claimed it was an accident, but she had shot her husband twice. This revelation planted doubts even in Detective McCarthy, who had initially believed her story. Still, he struggled to find a motive behind the crime. The Duffys seemed like a typical middle-class suburban family living near Los Angeles. Patrick had life insurance, but it had been taken out many years earlier. There was no evidence of infidelity either. Considering Linda's extreme eccentricity, McCarthy couldn't easily dismiss her version of events. Yet it became increasingly hard for him to believe her after speaking with Tracy Pock, a firearms expert brought into the investigation. Linda claimed she fired like the heroes in Westerns. This is indeed possible and relatively easy with the right firearm. The revolvers commonly used in Westerns are single action, meaning the shooter can pull the trigger and rapidly fan the hammer to fire multiple rounds in quick succession. The cylinder rotates with each pull, allowing the shooter to continue firing without interruption. Patrick Duffy owned 2 such revolvers, but the one Linda used that day was not among them. It was a double-action revolver, which requires significantly more effort to perform such a trick. To fire in a cowboy-style rapid sequence with a double-action revolver, a shooter must execute several actions in the correct order. Pull the trigger, release the hammer, fan the hammer, pull the trigger again, release the hammer, and fan the hammer, all at high speed, with little to no time for aiming. This made Linda's claim of an accidental shooting increasingly implausible. However, there was another issue. The deafening noise of the first gunshot and the weapon's recoil would likely have startled Linda. For someone unfamiliar with handling firearms, it would be nearly impossible to fire 2 shots so close together that the bullet holes were almost indistinguishable, let alone have them both strike Patrick's head in nearly the same spot. 2 years later, Linda Duffy was called back to the station and shown a video of firearms expert Tracy Peck demonstrating rapid fire with a revolver. Unexpectedly, Linda admitted that she needed to make a small correction to her story. She confessed that she and Patrick had been practicing cowboy-style shooting with unloaded guns for years, at least 15-20 times, she calmly told the stunned detectives. The detectives grew increasingly convinced that Linda's story had little to do with the truth. However, 2 major hurdles remain. 1, they still lack conclusive evidence to definitively disprove her claims. And 2, they wanted to give her one last chance to demonstrate how the events of that day unfolded. They made her an unusual proposal: meet them at a shooting range where they would bring a replica of the revolver used in the incident and have her reenact her actions from that day. This plan was sound from every angle. Either Linda would prove her version of events, or the police would gain evidence that it was impossible for her to have shot Patrick accidentally. Confident she posed no further danger, the detectives let her go home to consider the offer. Days turned into weeks, then months, but Linda never responded to their proposal. In time, detectives Lauren and McCarthy were reassigned, and with new partners and fresh cases demanding their attention, old investigations began to fade into the background. Yet a few months later, the detectives found themselves back at the Duffy residence. They were puzzled by Linda's lack of response to their offer. Their surprise turned to outright astonishment when they arrived to find a for sale sign on the lawn. Linda's sons informed them that their mother had gone on a honeymoon to Italy. 1 year after Patrick's death, Linda Duffy became Linda Gwatz, having married Lorenz Gwatz, a world-class saxophonist who had performed at Carnegie Hall. She had met him online a year after Patrick's passing. Linda moved to Mississippi, where her new husband worked as a professor of music. She changed her appearance, dyed her hair, adopted a new style, and even took a job at the same university as Lawrence. The detectives could only shake their heads at the bizarre turn of events. Several years passed, and it seemed Linda must have thought everyone had forgotten about her. But Patrick's family could not let go of the lingering questions surrounding his death. While Linda had told police it was a tragic accident, she gave a very different story to Patrick's family later that same evening. According to them, Linda claimed that Patrick had accidentally shot himself. Patrick's sister and brother, Catherine Hunt, and her sibling, were skeptical from the start. They had grown up around firearms and adhered strictly to one cardinal rule: always unload your weapon before bringing it into the house. The next day at the funeral home, Linda confided in Catherine. Trembling and fearful of being hated, she spun another incredible version of the incident, describing it again as a freak accident. Despite her insistence, Patrick's family remained unconvinced, but they assumed the police had closed the case as an accident. It troubled them deeply that Linda had lied to them about the events of that day, but they had no means to challenge her story. Yet as time passed, the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When they finally had the chance to revisit the case, Linda Duffy, or Linda Gwatz, was still on their minds. Detectives Lauren and McCarthy brought in a new expert, Paul Dolhauer, to examine the blood evidence from the crime scene. He reviewed the photos and police reports and concluded that Linda was lying. The woman claimed she had fired quickly and from the same spot. However, the blood spatter on her blouse in the wall told the expert a different story. According to her statements, the spatter appeared after the first shot, but for such patterns to form, the barrel would have had to be positioned 3 inches away from Patrick's head. The expert believed the second shot should have created a larger pool of blood on the floor, exactly where Linda claimed she had been standing. All that blood couldn't have avoided splashing onto her, yet she had only a few small drops on her. Police now believed that they had evidence proving Linda was lying. There was too little blood on her to support her story. The most likely scenario, according to investigators, was this. Patrick was asleep when his wife decided to commit the crime. She aimed and fired once, realized he was still alive, returned to the same position, aimed again, and fired a second time. This explained why the entry wounds were only 2 inches apart. The prosecutor decided to proceed with the case, and police spoke with Linda's colleagues. While they had always described her as charming, they now admitted they considered her a pathological liar. Even her close friend Julie said, "You either really liked Linda, or you realized you couldn't trust her. She always wanted to be the center of attention." This characterization was a revelation for the detectives and the district attorney, who concluded there was enough evidence to arrest Linda and charge her with the crime. 5 years after Patrick's death, Lieutenant McCarthy flew to Mississippi, where Linda was living with her new husband. For 2 weeks, members of the jury listened to incredible stories about Bugs Bunny, westerns, and testimony from experts on both sides who offered completely opposing interpretations of the events. It was too much for the jurors. They became deadlocked and could not reach a verdict, which meant a retrial would be necessary. The new trial began a year later, and Linda remained in jail during the interim. The battle between the prosecution and the defense was even fiercer this time. However, the prosecutor approached the case very differently. The main weakness of the prosecution's argument in the first trial was that, by all accounts, Linda and Patrick loved each other and were happy together. She had no obvious motive. This time, the prosecutor argued that Linda killed her husband because he was ill, and she feared having to care for him for the rest of his life. Additionally, the prosecutor decided not to show the jury interrogation videos in which Linda, sobbing uncontrollably, described her version of events to the police. By doing so, he effectively hamstrung the defense, which was barred from presenting those tapes themselves. As a result, the jury did not hear the story about Bugs Bunny, the couple's playful antics, or their cowboy-style shooting. Now, the only way for the jury to hear Linda's version of events was for her to testify and face cross-examination. This was exactly what the prosecutor was hoping for, but Linda was too afraid to take the stand. Her attorney found himself in a difficult position. He worried that without Linda's testimony, the jury would never hear about the fanfire shooting. However, he came up with a strategy. He discovered a reference to the shooting technique in Linda's 911 call, which had already been admitted as evidence by the prosecution. This allowed him to bring in a firearms expert who testified that firing a revolver like the one Linda used was not particularly difficult. Thus, the jury never heard about Linda and Patrick imitating cartoon characters. Instead, they were shown a compelling animation created by the prosecutor's office, vividly illustrating the prosecution's version of the events. In the animation, Linda calmly approached her sleeping husband and shot him. The jury deliberated for less than a day and found Linda guilty of second-degree murder. Linda's sons and her second husband pleaded with the judge for leniency, but his hands were tied. The verdict required him to sentence her to a term ranging from 40 years to life in prison. After the trial, journalists interviewed jurors from both the first and second trials to understand why the first jury had been unable to reach a verdict, while the second found her guilty within a day. Ironically, the old adage, "less is more," proved true in this case. In the first trial, the jury struggled to understand Linda's motive and could not convict her because everything might have happened as she explained. In the second trial, the jury heard only the bare facts, leaving no room for sentimentality.